Okay, this is the birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1978 through 79. Lecture 5, given on the 7th of February, 1979. Today I would like to try to finish what I began to say about post-war German neoliberalism. That is to say, the contemporary neoliberalism which actually involves us. I have tried to show you the problem which the question of the market raised for the 18th century. The problem was how, within a given state whose legitimacy could not be questioned, could you allow for a market freedom which was both historically and juridically new insofar as in the 18th century kind of police state freedom was almost only ever defined as the freedom of privilege, as a reserved freedom, as freedom linked to status, profession, or a concession of power, and so on. How was freedom of the market, as the freedom of laissez-faire, possible within a police state? This was the problem, and the answer given by the 18th century was ultimately simple and consisted in saying that what will give a place to market freedom and allow its insertion within raison d'etat and the police state is quite simply that left to itself and governed by laissez-faire, the market will be a source of the state's enrichment, growth, and therefore power. The answer of the 18th century was, in sum, that you will move towards more state by less government. The problem posed to Germany in 1945, or more precisely in 1948, if we take those texts and decisions I talked about last week as our reference point, was clearly a very different and opposite problem. This is what I tried to explain last week. The problem was, given a state that does not exist, if I can put it like that, and given the task of giving existence to a state, how can you legitimize this state in advance, as it were? How can you make it acceptable on the basis of an economic freedom which will both ensure its limitation and enable it to exist at the same time? This was the problem. The question that I tried to outline last week, and which constitutes, if you like, the historically and politically first objective of neoliberalism. I would now like to try to examine the answer more closely. How can economic freedom be the state's foundation and limitation at the same time? Its guarantee and security. Clearly, this calls for the re-elaboration of some of the basic elements of liberal doctrine. Not so much in the economic theory of liberalism, as in liberalism as an art of government, or, if you like, as a doctrine of government. I will break a bit from my habits and give a few biographical details about these people who were grouped around the future Chancellor Erhard and who programmed this new economic policy, this new way of connecting the economy and politics that is a characteristic feature of the present German Federal Republic. Who were these people? In the scientific commission I have talked about, and which was brought together by Erhard in 1948, there were a number of people, among the main ones being, first of all, Walter Eucken, a professional economist who at the start of the century was a student of Alfred Weber, the brother of Max Weber. Eucken was appointed professor of political economy at Freiburg in 1927, where he met Husserl, encountered phenomenology, and met a number of the jurists who were eventually so important in the theory of law in 20th century Germany, who themselves came into contact with phenomenology and who tried to re-elaborate a theory of law that tried to avoid both the constraints of 19th century historicism and Kelson's formalist, axiomatic, statist conception. In 1933, I am not sure of the date, Eucken wrote an article which caused a big stir at the time against the possible application of Keynesian methods to resolve the crisis in Germany. These methods were being advocated at the time by people like Lautenbach and Dr. Schacht. Eucken remained silent during the Nazi period. He was still professor at Freiburg. In 1936, he founded a journal with the name Ordo, and in 1940 published a book with the somewhat paradoxical title of Grundlagen der Nationalökonomie, which in reality is not about national economy, but precisely something which doctrinally and politically is fundamentally opposed to national economy. It was Eucken who formed the school of economists called the Freiburg School, or the Ordo Liberals, around the journal Ordo, which he directed. He then was one of the scientific advisors, no doubt the main one, brought together by Erhard in 1948. So there was Eucken, and there was also Franz Bohm, who was one of the jurists at Freiburg, a phenomenologist by training, or at least a disciple of Husserl up to a point. Franz Bohm later became a deputy in the Bundestag, and in the 70s he had a decisive influence on German economic policy. There was also Müller-Armack in the commission, who was an economic historian. I think a professor at Freiburg, but I am not absolutely sure, and who in 1941 wrote a very interesting book with the curious title of Genealogy of Economic Style, in which, outside of pure economic theory and outside of pure economic policy, he tries to define something that in a way would be an art of economic government, of governing economically, which he calls economic style. Müller-Armack became Ludwig Erhard's Secretary of State when the latter was Minister for the Economy and was one of the negotiators of the Rome Treaty. These, along with others, are some of the characters of this scientific commission. Behind this, we should also refer to some other people who also played an important role in this new definition of liberalism, of the liberal art of government. They were not members of the scientific commission, but some of them, at least, were people who inspired it. The main one being, obviously, Wilhelm Röpke, an economist in the Weimar period. He was one of Schleicher's counselors and should have become one of his ministers if Schleicher had not been dismissed in favor of Hitler at the start of 1933. Röpke was also an anti-Keynesian and was forced into exile in 1933. He went to Istanbul and then settled in Geneva, where he remained until the end of his career. In 1950, he published a little book entitled The Orientation of German Economic Policy, with a preface by Adenauer, which in a way represents the clearest, simplest, and most clear-cut manifesto for this new economic policy. Others should be added. With regard to Rope, I should add that during and just after the war, he wrote a kind of great trilogy which, together with the Grundlagen der Nationalökonomie, is a kind of Bible of this new liberalism. It is a work in 3 volumes, the first of which bears the title of Gesellschaftskrisis, the crisis of society, a term whose sad fate in contemporary political vocabulary you are familiar with, and which explicitly refers, of course, to Husserl's The Crisis of European Sciences. There was also Rustow. There was someone who is clearly very important, who also was not a member of the scientific commission, but whose career and trajectory was ultimately very important for the definition of contemporary neoliberalism. This is the Austrian von Hayek. He came from Austria and from neoliberalism. He immigrated at the time of, or just before, the Anschluss. He went to England and also to the United States. He was very clearly one of the inspirations of contemporary American liberalism and or of American anarcho-capitalism, if you like. And he returned to Germany in 1962, where he was appointed professor at Freiburg, thus closing the circle. I have mentioned these small biographical details for a number of reasons. The first is that it is clear that those in Germany in 1948 who grappled with and tried to resolve the problem of how to link together the legitimacy of a state and the freedom of economic partners, while accepting that the second must found the first, or serve as its guarantee, had already been dealing with this problem for a long time. The problem had already arisen within and at the time of the Weimar Republic, whose state legitimacy was constantly challenged and which had to struggle with well-known economic problems. And in the years between 1925 and 1930, People like Eucken, Bohm, and Ropke had to struggle with this problem. I have also given some biographical reference points to show you something which may be worth studying more closely for those who are interested in contemporary Germany. This is the curious closeness and parallels between what we call the Freiburg School, or Ordo liberals and their neighbors, as it were, the Frankfurt School. There is a parallel in the dates and equally in their fates, since part, at least, of the Freiburg School, like the Frankfurt School, was dispersed and forced into exile. There is the same type of political experience and also the same starting point, since, broadly speaking, both schools started from a problematic, I was going to say a political university problematic, which was dominant in Germany at the start of the 20th century, and which we can call Weberianism. What I mean is that Max Weber was a starting point for both schools, and we could say, to schematize drastically, that he functioned in early 20th century Germany as the person who, broadly speaking, displaced Marx's problem. If Marx tried to define and analyze what could be summed up as the contradictory logic of capital, Max Weber's problem, and the problem he introduced into German sociological, economic, and political reflection at the same time, is not so much the contradictory logic of capital as the problem of the irrational rationality of capitalist society. I think, again, very schematically, that what characterizes Max Weber's problem is this movement from capital to capitalism, from the logic of contradiction to the division between the rational and the irrational. And we can say roughly that the Frankfurt School, as well as the Freiburg School, Horkheimer, as well as Eucken, have simply taken up this problem in two different senses, two different directions. Again, schematically, the problem for the Frankfurt School was to determine what new social rationality could be defined and formed in such a way as to nullify economic irrationality. The decipherment of this irrational rationality of capitalism was also the problem for the Freiburg School. But people like Eucken, Ropke, and others try to resolve it in a different way, not by rediscovering, inventing, or defining the new form of social rationality, but by defining or redefining or rediscovering the economic rationality that will make it possible to nullify the social irrationality of capitalism. So, there were two opposed ways, if you like, for solving the same problem. Rationality or irrationality of capitalism, I don't know. The result anyway was, as you know, that both returned from exile to Germany in 1945-47. I am, of course, talking about those who were forced into exile. And history had it that in 1968, the last disciples of the Frankfurt School clashed with the police of a government inspired by the Freiburg School, thus finding themselves on the opposite sides of the barricades. For such was the double, parallel, crossed, and antagonistic fate of Weberianism in Germany. I have mentioned the career details of these people who inspired the programming of neoliberal politics in Germany for a third, clearly more important reason, which is that the experience of Nazism was at the very heart of their reflections. But I think we can say that Nazism was, in a way, the epistemological and political road to Damascus, in quotation marks, for the Freiburg School. That is to say, Nazism enabled them to define what I would like to call the field of adversity that they had to define and cross in order to reach their objective, putting forward a merely strategic analysis, that is to say, not an exhaustive analysis of their discourse. I would say that basically they had to do three things. First, they had to define an objective. This objective, which we analyzed last week, was to found the legitimacy of a state on the basis of a space of freedom for the economic partners. Okay, first, they had to define an objective. This objective, which we analyzed last week, was to found the legitimacy of a state on the basis of a space of freedom for the economic partners. This is the objective. It was the objective in 1948. It was basically already the objective around the years 1925 to 1930, although it was less urgent, less clear, and less clear-cut. Second, they had to define not just the set of adversaries they could come up against in achieving this objective, but fundamentally, the general system with which this objective and the pursuit of this objective could clash. That is to say, the whole set of obstacles and enemies which, broadly speaking, constitutes the field of adversity with which they had to deal. And the third operation they had to carry out to cross this field of adversity and achieve their objective was, of course, the distribution or redistribution of the conceptual or technical resources available to them. I would like to develop the last 2 points of this strategic analysis a little today. How did they constitute their field of adversity? That is to say, how did they find the overall logic of the set of enemy obstacles or adversaries with which they had to deal? I think the experience of Nazism was very important here. Of course, German liberal thought, although relatively subdued, was not born with the Freiburg School. For many years, there were people like Lucio Brentano, for example, who tried to support and maintain the classical themes of liberalism in a climate that was clearly not very favorable. Very schematically, we can say that from practically the middle of the 19th century, there were a number of major obstacles to and criticisms of liberalism and liberal politics in Germany, appearing successively on the historical scene. Again, this is very schematic. First, there was the principle practically formulated in 1840 by list, that in Germany at least, national policy and a liberal economy could not be compatible. The failure of the Zollverein to constitute a German state on the basis of an economic liberalism was in a way the proof of this. Liszt and his successors laid down the principle that, far from being the general formula universally applicable to any economic policy, liberal economics could only ever be, and was in fact, only ever a tactical instrument or strategy for some countries to obtain an economically hegemonic and politically imperialist position over the rest of the world. In a clear and simple terms, Liberalism is not the general form of which every economic policy must adopt. Quite simply, liberalism is English policy. It is the policy of English domination. As a general rule, it is also the policy suited to a maritime nation. To that extent, Germany, with its history, with its geographical position, with the whole set of constraints in which it is held, cannot afford a liberal economic policy. It needs a protectionist economic policy. The second, both theoretical and political obstacle that German liberalism encountered at the end of the 19th century was Bismarckian state socialism. For a unified German nation to exist, it must not only be protected against the outside by a protectionist policy. In addition, internally, everything that could compromise national unity must be brought under control, suppressed, and generally speaking, the proletariat as a threat to the unity of the nation and state must be effectively reintegrated within a social and political consensus. This is roughly the theme of Bismarckian state socialism, the second obstacle to a liberal politics. The third obstacle, starting with the war, was obviously the development of a planned economy, that is to say, the technique which Germany was forced to adopt by its wartime situation, and which consisted in the organization of a centralized economy under an administrative apparatus which took the most important decisions in the economic order. Allocating scarce resources, fixing prices, and guaranteeing full employment. Germany did not abandon the planned economy at the end of the war, since planning was then renewed by both socialist and non-socialist governments. Practically from Rathenau until 1933, Germany had an economy in which planning and economic centralization was a recurrent, if not a constant, form. Finally, the fourth obstacle, which arrived later on the scene in Germany was Keynesian style interventionism. From 1925, more or less, in 1930, German Keynesians like Lautenbach, for example, make the same kind of criticisms of liberalism as Keynesians in general, and they propose a number of state interventions on the general balances of the economy. So from before the Nazi seizure of power, we have four elements: a protected economy, state socialism, economic planning, and Keynesian interventionism. These four elements acted as barriers to a liberal policy. And from the end of the 19th century, they were the object of a series of discussions conducted by the few partisans of liberalism living in Germany. In a way, the German neoliberals will be the heirs of this dispersed heritage, of this series of discussions. I know I am giving a caricature of the situation, and that in actual fact there was no discontinuity between these different elements, but rather a sort of continuous transition, a sort of continuous network. The movement from economic protectionism to the economy of state aid was quite natural. Rathenau-type planning, for example, was more or less reutilized in a Keynesian perspective at the end of the 1920s and in 1930s. All of this was connected, of course, but it did not form a system. Now, what Nazism finally contributed was the strict coalescence of these different elements. That is to say, the organization of an economic system in which protectionist economics, the economics of state aid, the planned economy, and Keynesian economics formed a firmly secured whole in which the different parts were bound together by the economic administration that was set up. The Keynesian policy of Dr. Schacht was taken over in 1936 by the four-year plan which Göring was responsible, and for which, moreover, he was surrounded by some of Rathenau's counselors. Planning had a double objective. On the one hand, to ensure the economic autarky of Germany, that is to say, an absolute protectionism, and on the other, a policy of state aid, all, of course, entailing inflationary effects that war preparations. This was, if you like, a militarized economy, enabled to be financed. All this formed a whole. I would say that faced with the Nazi system, the theoretical, speculative coup de force of the German neoliberals was not to say, as most people did at the time, and especially the Keynesians. The economic system the Nazis are setting up is a monstrosity. They are combining elements that are actually heterogeneous, which constrict the German economy within an armature of mutually contradictory and disparate elements. The coup de force of the Ordo liberals was not to say Nazism is the product of an extreme state of crisis, the final point towards which an economy and a politics unable to overcome their contradictions are carried, and Nazism as the extreme solution cannot serve as an analytical model for general history, or at any rate for the past history of capitalism in Europe. The Ordo liberals refuse to see Nazism as this monstrosity, this economic hodgepodge, this solution of the last resort at the final point of crisis. They say Nazism is a truth, or rather they say Nazism is the revelation of the necessary system of relations between these different elements. The neoliberals say, take any of these elements, a protected economy or Keynesian type intervention. These are, of course, apparently different things, but you will never be able to develop one without arriving in one way or another at the other. That is to say, the neoliberals say that these four elements which German economic and political history successively brought onto the scene of governmental action are economically linked to each other, and if you adopt one of them, you will not escape the other three. Taking up this schema in principle, they taking up this schema and principle, they successively study different types of economy, like Soviet planning, for example. Those like Hayek, who had a good knowledge of the United States, took the example of the New Deal, and others took up the English example, and in particular, the examples of Keynesian policy in the big beverage programs worked out during the war. They took all this and said, you can see anyway that, first, these are the same principles at work, and second, each of these elements will attract the other three. It was in this way that in 1943 or 44, I no longer remember, Rope published, not without boldness and nerve, an analysis of the beverage plan which had been worked out during the war, and he said to the English, what you are preparing for yourselves with your beverage plan is quite simply Nazism. On one side, you battle with the Germans militarily, but economically and so politically, you are in the process of repeating their lessons. English Labour Party socialism will lead you to German-style Nazism. The beverage plan will lead you to the Göring plan, to the 4-year plan of 1936. Consequently, they tried to pinpoint a sort of economic political invariant that could be found in political regimes as different as Nazism and parliamentary England, the Soviet Union and America of the New Deal. They tried to identify this relational invariant in these different regimes, and they laid down the principle that the important difference was no longer between this or that constitutional structure. The real problem was between a liberal politics and any other form whatsoever of economic interventionism, whether it takes the relatively mild form of Keynesianism or the drastic form of an autarkic plan like that of Germany. So we have an invariant that could be called, if you like, the anti-liberal invariant, which possesses its own logic and internal necessity. This was what the Ordo liberals deciphered in the experience of Nazism. The second lesson they drew from Nazism was the following. What, they said, is Nazism? Essentially, and above all, it is the unlimited growth of state power. To tell the truth, this claim, which now seems to us a commonplace, presented a paradox. And also represented a theoretical or analytical coup de force. For when we look at how National Socialist Germany functioned, I think the least we can say is that, at first sight at least, Nazism was the first systematic attempt to initiate the withering away of the state. Nazism is the withering away of the state for a number of reasons. First, this appears in the very juridical structure of the nationalist socialist Germany, since, as you know, in National Socialist Germany, the state lost the status of juridical personality in as much as the state could only be defined in law as the instrument of something else, which was the true foundation of right, namely the people, the Volk. The Volk in its community organization, the people as Gemeinschaft, is at once the principle of right and the objective behind every organization, behind every juridical institution, the state included. The state may well express the Volk. It may well express the Gemeinschaft. And it may well be the form in which the Gemeinschaft both manifests itself and produces its actions. But the state will be nothing more than this form, or rather, than this instrument. Second, in Nazism, the state is, as it were, disqualified from within, since the principle of the internal operation of all the apparatuses was not an administrative kind of hierarchy with the game of authority and responsibility typical of European administrations since the 19th century. It was the principle of the Verurteilung, the principle of conduction, to which loyalty and obedience had to correspond, which means that in the form of the state's structure, nothing must be preserved of the vertical communication from below to above and from above to below between the different elements of this Gemeinschaft, of the Volk. Finally, third, the existence of the party and the whole legislative system which governed relations between the administrative apparatus and the party, vested essential authority in the party at the expense of the state. The subordinate position of the state is clearly marked by its systematic destruction, or at any rate, its reduction to the pure and simple instrument of the community of the people, which was the Führer principle, which was the existence of the party. Deciphering this situation, the Ordo liberals reply, "Don't be deceived. The state is apparently disappearing. It has all apparently been subordinated and renounced. Nonetheless, it remains the case that if the state is subordinated in this way, it is quite simply because the traditional forms of the 19th century state cannot stand up to this new demand for state control that the economic policy of the Third Reich calls for. In fact, if you adopt the economic system I have been talking about, then you will need a sort of superstate to make it work. A supplement to the state, which the present organizational and institutional forms we are familiar with cannot assure. Hence, the necessity precisely for this new state to extend beyond itself in comparison with the forms we know, and need to create these sorts of supplements of the state, these intensifiers of state power represented by the theme of the Gemeinschaft, by the principle of obedience to the Führer, and by the existence of the party. So, everything presented by the Nazis as the destruction of the bourgeois and capitalist state are in fact supplements of the state, a state in the process of being born, institutions undergoing stratification, a consequence of this, and what enables the Ordo liberals to draw a different conclusion is that there is, in fact, a necessary link between this economic organization and this growth of the state, which means that none of these elements of the economic system can be adopted without the other three arriving gradually in its wake, and to be established and to work. Each of these elements calls precisely for the growth of state power. The economic invariant, on the other hand, and on the other, the growth of the power of the state, even in apparently aberrant forms in comparison with the classical state, are absolutely bound up with each other. Finally, the third coup de force that Nazism allowed the neoliberals to carry out with regard to the problem they wanted to resolve is the following. The Nazi analysis of capitalist, bourgeois, utilitarian, and individualistic society can be traced back to Sombart in so far as it was expressed and epitomized by Sombart in his trajectory between 1900 and 1930, from quasi-Marxism to quasi-Nazism. The best summary is in his book, Der Deutsche Sozialismus. What have the bourgeois and capitalist economy and state produced? They have produced a society in which individuals have been torn from their natural community and brought together in the flat, anonymous form of the mass. Capitalism produces the mass. Capitalism consequently produces what Sombart does not exactly call one-dimensionality. But this is precisely what he defines. Capitalism and bourgeois society have deprived individuals of direct and immediate communication with each other, and they are forced to communicate through the intermediary of a centralized administrative apparatus. They have, therefore, reduced individuals to the state of atoms subject to an abstract authority in which they do not recognize themselves. Capitalist society has also forced individuals into a type of mass consumption with the functions of standardization and normalization. Finally, this bourgeois and capitalist economy has doomed individuals to communicate with each other only through the play of signs and spectacles. In Sombart's, and in fact already from around 1900, we find that well-known critique, which has now become one of the commonplaces of a thought, whose articulation and framework we do not know very well. The critique of mass society, of the society of one-dimensional man, of authority, of consumption, of the spectacle, and so forth. That is what Sombart said. What's more, it is what the Nazis took up in their own way. And it was indeed in opposition to this destruction of society by the capitalist economy and state that the Nazis proposed to do what they wished to do. But say the neoliberals, what do the Nazis actually do with their organization, their party, and their principle of the Führertum? In reality, all they do is intensify this mass society, this society of standardizing and normalizing consumption. This society of signs and spectacles. Look at Nazi society as it actually functions. We are dealing entirely with the order of the mass. The masses at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg spectacles. Standard consumption for everyone. The idea of the Volkswagen, and so on. All of this is only the renewal and intensification of all those features of bourgeois capitalist society that Sombart Sombart had denounced, and which the Nazis claimed to be rejecting. And why is this? Why do they only renew what they claim to denounce? If not because all these elements are not the effect and product of capitalist society, as Sombart claimed, and as the Nazis claim after him. Rather, they are the product and the effect of a society that economically does not accept liberalism, of a society, or rather a state, that has chosen a policy of protectionism and planning in which the market does not perform its function, and in which the state or para-state administration takes responsibility for the everyday life of individuals. These mass phenomena of standardization and the spectacle are linked to statism, to anti-liberalism, and not to a market economy. To summarize all this, the decisive point of the Nazi experience for the Freiburg liberals, and this was their choice of adversary, if you like, the way in which they set up the field of adversity necessary for the definition of their strategy was that, first, they thought they could establish that Nazism was the product of an economic invariant which is indifferent and, as it were, impervious to the capitalism-socialism opposition and to the constitutional organization of the states. Second, they thought they could establish National Socialism as an invariant which, as both cause and effect, was absolutely bound up with the unlimited growth of state power. And third, that the first major and visible effect of this invariant linked to the growth of the state was a destruction of the network the tissue of the social community, a destruction which, through a sort of chain reaction, a loop, calls precisely for protectionism, a centrally planned economy, and an increase in the power of the state. Broadly speaking, everything which opposes liberalism and proposes state management of the economy thus constitutes an invariant whose history can be seen throughout the development of European societies since the end of the 19th century, and more precisely, from the start of the 20th century. That is to say, when the liberal art of government became, so to speak, intimidated by its own consequences, and tried to limit the consequences that it ought to have drawn itself from its own development. How did it try to limit them? Well, by a technique of intervention which consisted in applying to society and the economy a type of rationality considered valid within the natural sciences. In short, what we can broadly call technology. Technicization of state management, of course, of control of the economy, and also in the analysis of economic phenomena, is what the Ordo liberals call eternal Saint Simonism. And they identify Saint Simon with the birth of that vertigo which takes hold of the liberal art of government and leads it to seek a principle of limitation, a principle of organization in the application to society of a schema of rationality specific to nature, a principle which ultimately leads to Nazism. So, from Saint Simon to Nazism, there is a cycle of rationality entailing interventions which entail the growth of the state, which entails setting up an administration that itself functions according to technical types of rationality. And this constitutes precisely the genesis of Nazism over 2 centuries, or at any rate, a century and a half of the history of capitalism. Making this type of analysis, of course, I am oversimplifying everything they said between 1935 and 40 or 50. And putting forward this analysis at the borders of political reflection, economic analysis, and sociology, the Ordo liberals launched a fine, scathing attack. Since a familiar type of discourse and analysis takes off through this kind of analysis, the traditional critiques of bourgeois society and the analysis of bureaucracy. And the idea of Nazism we all have in our heads. The theme of Nazism as the revelation and final point of an, in some way, historically natural development of capitalism, the negative theology of the state as the absolute evil, the possibility of sweeping up events in the Soviet Union and the USA, concentration camps and social security records, and to the same critique, and so on. you are familiar with all of this, and I think it originates in this series of theoretical and analytical coup de force of ordo-liberalism. But with regard to what I would like to say, this is not for me the most important thing. The essential thing is the conclusion the ordo-liberals drew from this series of analysis, namely, since Nazism shows that the defects and destructive effects traditionally attributed to the market economy should instead be attributed to the state and its intrinsic defects and specific rationality, then the analysis must be completely overturned. Our question should not be, given a relatively free market economy, how should the state limit it so as to minimize its harmful effects? We should reason completely differently and say, nothing proves that the market economy is intrinsically defective, since everything attributed to it as a defect and as the effect of its defectiveness should really be attributed to the state. So, let's do the opposite and demand even more from the market economy than was demanded from it in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the market was called upon to say to the state, beyond such and such a limit regarding such and such a question, and starting at the borders of such and such a domain, you will no longer intervene. This is not enough. The ordo-liberals say, since it turns out that the state is the bearer of intrinsic defects, and there is no proof that the market economy has these defects. Let's ask the market economy itself to be the principle, not of the state's limitation, but of its internal regulation from start to finish, of its existence and action. In other words, instead of accepting a free market defined by the state and kept, as it were, under state supervision, which was, in a way, the initial formula of liberalism, let us establish a space of economic freedom, and let us circumscribe it by a state that will supervise it. The ordo-liberals say we should completely turn the formula around and adopt the free market as organizing and regulating principle of the state from the start of its existence up to the last form of its interventions. In other words, a state under the supervision of the market rather than a market supervised by the state. I think this kind of reversal, which the ordo-liberals were only able to carry out on the basis of their analysis of Nazism, enabled them in 1948 to try to resolve the problem they faced of finding a way of giving legitimacy to a state that did not yet exist and that had to be made acceptable to those who most mistrusted it. Well, let's adopt the free market and we will have a mechanism that will found the state, and at the same time, by controlling it, will provide the guarantees demanded by those who have grounds for mistrusting it. This, I think, was the reversal they carried out. And what is important and decisive in current neoliberalism can, I think, be situated here. For we should not be under any illusion that today's neoliberalism is, as is too often said, the resurgence or recurrence of old forms of liberal economics which were formulated in the 18th and 19th centuries and are now being reactivated by capitalism for a variety of reasons to do with its impotence and crisis, as well as with some more or less local and determinate political objectives. In actual fact, something much more important is at stake in modern neoliberalism, whether this takes the German form I am presently referring to, or the anarcho-liberal American form. What is at issue is whether a market economy can in fact serve as the principal form and model for a state which, because of its defects, is mistrusted by everyone on both the right and the left. For one reason or another, everyone is in agreement in criticizing the state and identifying its destructive and harmful effects. But within this general critique, which is also a confused critique, since it can be found with little difference from Sombart to Marcuse, through and in the shadow of this critique, will liberalism in fact be able to bring about its real objective, that is to say, a general formalization of the powers of the state and the organization of society based on the basis of the market economy? Can the market really have the power of formalization for both the state and society? This is the important, crucial problem of present-day liberalism, and to what extent it represents an absolutely important mutation with regard to traditional liberal projects, those that were born in the 18th century. It is not just a question of freeing the economy. It is a question of knowing how far the market economy's powers of political and social information extend. This is the stake. Well, in order to give a positive answer and affirm that the market economy really can both inform the state and reform society, or reform the state and inform society. The Ordo liberals carried out a number of shifts, transformations, and inversions in traditional liberal doctrine. And it is these transformations that I would now like to explain a little. Hold up. Wait a minute. Okay, here we go. So, the first shift is that of exchange. A shift from exchange to competition in the principle of the market. Putting it again very roughly, how was the market defined in the 18th century liberalism? Or rather, on what basis was it described? It was defined and described on the basis of free exchange between two partners who, through this exchange, establish the equivalence of two values. The model and the principle of the market was exchange, and the freedom of the market, the non-intervention of a third party, of any authority whatsoever, and a fortiori of state authority was, of course, applied so that the market was valid, and equivalence really was equivalence. The most that was asked of the state was that it supervise the smooth running of the market, that is to say, that it ensure respect for the freedom of those involved in exchange. The state did not have to intervene within the market, therefore. On the other hand, the state was called upon to intervene in production in the sense that liberal economists in the middle of the 18th century said that when you produce something, that is to say, when you are investing work in something, it is necessary that everyone respects the individual ownership of what is produced. It was for this the necessity of private property for production that state authority was demanded, but the market must be a cleared space free from intervention. Now, for the neoliberals, the most important thing about the market is not exchange. That kind of original and fictional situation imagined by 18th century liberal economists. The essential thing of the market is elsewhere. It is competition. In this, moreover, the neoliberals only follow a development of liberal thought, of liberal doctrine and theory in the 19th century. Practically, since the end of the 19th century, more or less, all liberal theory has accepted that the most important thing about the market is competition, that is to say, not equivalence, but on the contrary, inequality. It is the problem of competition and monopoly, much more than that of value and equivalence, that forms the essential armature of a theory of the market. On this point, therefore, the ordo-liberals do not depart in any way from the historical development of liberal thought. They take up this classical conception and the principle that competition, and only competition, can ensure economic rationality. How does it ensure economic rationality? Well, it ensures it through the formation of prices, which, precisely to the extent that there is full and complete competition, can measure economic magnitudes and thus regulate choices. With regard to this liberalism focused on the problem of competition, this theory of the market focused on competition, the ordo-liberals introduce something that I think is specific to them. In fact, the 19th and 20th century marginalist and neo-marginalist conception of the market economy said that since the market can only function through free and full competition, the state must therefore refrain from altering the existing state of competition and carefully avoid introducing elements that will alter this state of competition through phenomena of monopoly, control, and so forth. At the most, it must intervene to prevent competition being distorted by phenomena like monopoly, for example. So the same conclusion is still drawn from this principle of the market economy, as was drawn by those of the 18th century who defined the market economy by exchange, namely laissez-faire. In other words, from the principle of the market economy, both 18th century and 19th century liberals draw the same conclusion of the necessity of laissez-faire. The former deduce it from exchange, the latter deduce it from competition, but in any case, the logical political consequence of the market economy is laissez-faire. This is where the ordo-liberals break with the tradition of the 18th and 19th century liberalism. They say, laissez-faire cannot and must not be the conclusion drawn from the principle of competition as the organizing form of the market. Why not? Because, they say, when you deduce the principle of laissez-faire from the market economy, basically you are still in the grip of what could be called a naive naturalism. That is to say, whether you define the market by exchange or by competition, you are thinking of it as a sort of given of nature, something produced spontaneously, which the state must respect precisely inasmuch as it is a natural datum. But the ordo-liberals say, and here it is easy to spot the influence of Husserl, this is naive naturalism. For what in fact is competition? It is absolutely not a given of nature. The game, mechanisms, and effects of competition which we identify and enhance are not at all natural phenomena. Competition is not the result of a natural interplay of appetites, instincts, behavior, and so on. In reality, the effects of competition are due only to the essence that characterizes and constitutes it. The beneficial effects of competition are not due to a pre-existing nature. To a natural given that it brings with it. They are due to a formal privilege. Competition is an essence. Competition is an eidos. Competition is a principle of formalization. Competition has an internal logic. It has its own structure. Its effects are only produced if this logic is respected. It is, as it were, a formal game between inequalities. It is not a natural game between individuals and behaviors. Just as for Husserl, a formal structure is only given to intuition under certain conditions. In the same way, competition as an essential economic logic will only appear and produce its effects under certain conditions, which have to be carefully and artificially constructed. This means that pure competition is not a primitive given. It can only be the result of lengthy efforts, and in truth, pure competition is never attained. Pure competition must and can only be an objective thus presupposing an indefinitely active policy. Competition is therefore an historical objective of governmental art and not a natural given that must be respected. In this kind of analysis we find, of course, both the influence of Husserl and, in a somewhat Weberian way, the possibility of connecting up history with the economy. The Ordo liberals go on to say that the task of economic theory is the analysis of competition as a formal mechanism and the identification of its optimum effects. But what actually takes place in these societies we know cannot be analyzed on the basis of this theory of competition. We can only analyze it by taking the real historical systems within which these formal economic processes function and are formed and conditioned. Consequently, we need an historical analysis of the systems that intersect, as it were. A horizontal intersects a vertical. The formal analysis of economic processes. Economics analyzes the formal processes, and history will analyze the systems in which the operation of these formal processes is either possible or impossible. The third consequence they draw from this is that the relation between an economy of competition and a state can no longer be one of the reciprocal delimitation of different domains. There will not be the market game, which must be left free, and then the domain in which the state begins to intervene, since the market, or rather pure competition, which is the essence of the market, can only appear if it is produced, and if it is produced by an active governmentality. There will thus be a sort of complete superimposition of market mechanisms indexed to competition and governmental policy. Government must accompany the market economy from start to finish. The market economy does not take something away from government. Rather, it indicates, it constitutes the general index in which one must place the rule for defining all governmental action. One must govern for the market rather than because of the market. To that extent, you can see that the relationship defined by 18th century liberalism is completely reversed. The problem thus becomes, what type of delimitation of government follows from this principle, or rather, what will be the effect of the art of government, this principle that the market is what ultimately must be produced in government. And like a good cereal, this is what I will try to explain next week.